Well, I think it is 1:00. And for those of you who were with us in November, you know we ran out of time at the end. So in the interest of making good use of our time and hopefully having some time at the end for conversation, let's go ahead and get started. So welcome. I'm Heather Loughlin, president of the St. Croix Valley Foundation. On behalf of our foundation and of our generous sponsor and partner, First State Bank and Trust, I am delighted to welcome you to Conversations of the Valley. I want to start by thanking you for your flexibility regarding today's program. While we believe our program today is very important, we also knew there was another important event happening today. So hopefully the change that we made enabled those of you who were interested in both the inauguration and our program to be part of both of those events. So thanks again for your flexibility. To help kick off today's program, I'm going to turn the screen over to Fatima, a student at Hamline University and a graduate of Stillwater Area High School.
My name is Fatima. I'm 19 years old, though I'll be 20 soon. I was born in Cameroon, which is in West Africa. I was actually born in the capital, Yaoundé, but my parents are both from like different villages, like Fumban and I think Bamenda. And then when I was 7 years old, my mom had moved over here when I was 3 years old, but when I was 7, my dad brought me over so I could like join her, and now I live in St. Paul.
And what do you do now?
I'm a college student at Hamline University. I'm a sophomore. I think I'm just very proud to be Black and to be African, and especially to be like a Black woman. Like being a Black person and being a Black woman specifically, like the intersections that takes. And I especially am so proud of being African and an African woman, because seeing the way my mom came to this country, like, you know, it just makes me think like how strong you have to be to do all that and like, you know, have kids who don't really understand the full story and can't understand the sacrifice you're making, but still have the strength to be like, okay, you know, I've got to do this. I've got to be my own support system because these kids are too young to support me in the way I need to be supported. There's a lot of trauma around schools and adults and education for me, because teachers already have one perspective of what it means to be a good student. And as far as they were concerned, the perfect student came to school with their homework done. But if you do not have parents who can support you in that way, I have a parent who speaks another language. I have a parent whose education was disrupted because Civil War, and they came here, like, you know, my mom was going to college at the same time I was going to school. She wasn't just going to work, she was getting her education, you know? So like, I didn't have the same support at home, and that starts with like not realizing that people are different. If you don't have parents who can support you in the way that other kids' parents can support them, then you cannot make it to the classroom, you know, prepared in the way that teachers expect you to be prepared in. So even like, it wasn't even like outright racism, it was just like different little like ways that the system is already structured that isolated you. You know, we all read this article that we're all at an event, or we read a book, or read an article, or hear someone's story that like impacts our lives, and then we're just like, oh, that was so meaningful, and then go back to our lives, you know? Don't let this just be like a meaningful thing. It's not like, you know, I'm seeing that all these things are happening in the world. Are you looking at organizations? How are you supporting the people who are doing that work? Am I giving money? Like, if I can myself speak up in ways that organizations can, am I giving them money to support their work, you know? Like, how can I support them? And even if you can't give money, like, stick to social media and make sure you're actually reading their work and engaging with them. So seeing the way that even with those two identities and facing those two intersections of oppression, like Black women have been able to share their experiences, it makes me inspired, because you have these stories of sacrifice, you it makes everything so much more personal for me. Like my education is so personal, my voice is so personal. So it's just like, I guess it's an honor. I feel really proud to be those things.
"25 years ago, a small group of passionate citizens got together and decided that we needed a community foundation right here in the Valley, a foundation that would be focused on supporting the unique assets and needs of our region. From those conversations emerged the organization we now know as the St. Croix Valley Foundation. Our mission is to enhance quality of life in the St. Croix Valley, and we do this by encouraging and supporting charitable giving, connecting people and programs, and encouraging collaboration. One way that we encourage collaboration is through convenings, bringing people and organizations together to find solutions to community concerns. That is really what these community conversations, these conversations of the Valley are all about. Getting people together to learn, talk, and think about how we might respond to some of the issues facing our region. As you know, the theme of this year's Conversations of the Valley series is racial justice, listening and learning. As I mentioned at our first event in November, it took some time to land on that theme. After George Floyd's death on May 25th and the ensuing demands for racial justice, we weren't quite sure how to respond. On one hand, this was all happening not so far from the Valley. On the other hand, our predominantly white Valley communities sometimes seemed worlds away from all of this. And yet there seems to be a growing recognition that it's perhaps less about being worlds away and more about being worlds apart. It's our hope that this series on racial justice will bring the experiences of Blacks and Native Americans more clearly into focus for all who call the Valley home. It is with intention that we started today's program with Fatima, talking about her experience of race right here in the Valley. Throughout this year's series, we're sharing videos intending to lift up the voice of students whose stories we hope will help you deepen your own understanding of how racism impacts people right here in our Valley communities. I know we don't all come to this conversation with the same experiences, perspectives, or opinions, and that's okay. To really begin to address racism, we need to start with ourselves and with being willing to listen and learn from others whose experiences are different from our own. So before I introduce today's speaker, just a few quick words about our Zoom format. First, we are in a meeting format, which is why you're able to scroll through and look for familiar faces. But to help keep things running smoothly, we have muted all participants. We will have time at the end for questions. And so if you have questions during the presentation, type them into the chat box in Zoom. You can access that chat icon, chat box from the chat icon at the bottom of your screen. And finally, while we suggest putting Zoom on speaker view so that the majority of your screen is filled with our speaker, you can also go to gallery view to scroll through all participants. So with that, I am delighted to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Bill Green. Dr. Green grew up in the South in the midst of the civil rights movement. His parents were both activists, and he attended public schools in New Orleans the first year those schools were integrated. He came to cold Minnesota to attend Gustavus Adolphus College, where he earned a BA in history. He went on to earn an MA, JD, and PhD from the University of Minnesota. Yes, he is one smart guy. He has published articles, op-ed pieces, book chapters, and books on history, law, education, race, and civil rights, much of this focused on Minnesota. In fact, you may have recently read about Dr. Green in our local papers, as his newest book, Nellie Francis, Fighting for Racial Justice and Women's Equality in Minnesota, was just published in January. Not only an accomplished scholar who has spoken and lectured widely, Dr. Green also served on the Minneapolis Public Schools Board of Education from 1993 to 2001, and then stepped in as superintendent of Minneapolis Public Schools from 2006 to 2010. In an interview with the Twin Cities Daily Planet shortly after stepping into that superintendent role, Dr. Green discussed the persistent racial disparities in educational outcomes, particularly for Black students, and about the underlying institutional racism that contributed to those disparities. Dr. Green acknowledged the complexity of addressing these issues, noting that, quote, "The language that we use to describe race is outdated, and it sends people into defensive modes. So the best way to proceed is not to proceed at all. We've got to find a better way to talk about race and have a community discussion." Dr. Green, thank you so much for being here with us today to help us find a better way to talk about race and have a community discussion. We are ready to listen and learn. Welcome.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction. You left out one thing of many things you said, and that was when I was, my parents were academics, and when they asked me where I wanted to go to school, I said, you know, I wanted to study abroad because I knew that that would impress them. And so they sent me to Minnesota. So that's how I ended up here. I'm glad I came here and never left. Tried other places, but found that Minnesota was a wonderful home and a wonderful place to raise family. And this is my home now. You know, in thinking about how to talk about this topic, I'm thankfully in history. I teach history because I view history as stories, and history and telling stories is really kind of dealing with narratives, because it is through that means that you can get at the, I believe, the much more complex issues that sometimes fiction, or at least stories, get at, that traditional classroom experiences don't permit you to do. And so what I wanted to do today was to talk about an exceptionally difficult topic, and that is talking beyond the racial chasm that exists between Blacks and whites in a historical perspective. I mean, I think that it's always important to provide a historical perspective. And in telling these stories, I'd like to try to share some connections that I think exist with today's times as well. How some of those dynamics that I'll be talking about historically seem to have carried over to today. And if time permits, and I'm going to work hard to make sure that time will permit, at least on my end, I'd like to read to you a very brief statement by one of the people I just got finished writing about regarding the nature of invisibility. The moment that an African American becomes successful, they become invisible to the body politic. So with that, let me just get started with the two scenarios I want to share to open up this discussion. The first one deals with Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass used to come to Minnesota in the wake of the Civil War to speak. He found Minnesota in St. Paul and Minneapolis in particular to be especially friendly territory. It was a good place to raise funds, but it was also a very friendly place where people took seriously, white people took seriously the relationship and the new accord that they were building for African Americans in this new world, especially in the wake of the Civil War. In 1873, in one such trip, he came to St. Paul to speak on the advancement of African Americans. In the auditorium where he spoke, he was greeted with a very friendly audience. These were very wealthy people too. Many of them were employers, bankers, political leaders, and they had been supporters of the right side of the war, of course. They had supported Lincoln and the Union and the emancipation of African Americans and the citizenship of African Americans and the enfranchisement of African Americans. So they were on the right side of angels, so to speak. When Frederick Douglass came to speak, they came to hear him talk about the advancement, the status of African Americans 10 years after the war had have been fought. Actually, the war ended in 65, and this was 73, so we're talking about shorter time period. And as he spoke, a mob formed outside the hall. Knowing that this was Frederick Douglass, these were working class white people who began to taunt, scream, yell, threaten Frederick Douglass that he should leave or be killed. They threatened to kill him. The audience inside the hall cheered to try to drown out their catcalls. And so you had this rather perverse, I think, situation where a mob outside was screaming and the friendly audience inside was screaming just as loudly. No one called the police. It seemed like a situation that was quickly going to get out of control. Frederick Douglass changed his topic from talking about the status of Black America in the wake of the Civil War to one that justified the end of slavery. It was a sort of outdated speech, but one that he felt the need and was called to give. At the end of the speech, people were applauding. They were standing on their chairs, cheering him. The host of the occasion, Gilbert Dutcher, who owned the most prestigious hotel in St. Paul and was a personal friend of Frederick Douglass, approached him on stage and told him, look, I want you to stay at in the best room in my hotel tonight. I know that you have to leave town tomorrow, but I want you to have the best room in St. Paul. And of course, this drew a huge ovation from the audience as well. Much later, Frederick Douglass leaves the auditorium and he heads over to the hotel. And, if you stop to think about it, you kind of know what's going to happen next. The owner of the hotel did not inform the clerk that Fred was coming to the hotel for a room. So when Douglass approached the counter, the cashier, the concierge, who looked up and saw this Black man and says, we don't permit people of your type in this hotel. We don't let Black people in the hotel. This is St. Paul. There's a hotel that's owned by not only a friend of Frederick Douglass, but someone who had fought on the side of the Union to emancipate all Blacks and had been a host of Frederick Douglass. This employee denied Frederick Douglass a room. And so Douglass picked up his bag and left and started walking the streets of St. Paul. Now, this was in February of 1873. That's a time when Minnesota used to really have winters, not like what we have now, right? And he's in his 60s. He's a man who's reaching that tender age of ripeness, so to speak. But he's looking for a place to stay. He goes to another hotel and is denied a room there. This hotel is also owned by one of the founders of the Republican Party and a Lincoln Republican and a friend of Black people, but his hotel still discriminated. Much later, when Douglass ran into his friend Dutcher, who had first offered him a room, Douglass brought him to the hotel, put him in the room, and Douglass was able to, Dutcher brought him to the hotel and Douglass was able to have a warm place to stay, but he was not allowed to go downstairs to eat. He was very hungry. His friend told him, you stay in the room, we'll send food up to you, but don't come downstairs, whatever you do. The point that I want to share here is this. These two men were friends. And at no time did Douglass say anything to Dutcher about the discriminatory practice, because if this hotel could discriminate against an African-American of note, Frederick Douglass, a confidant to Abraham Lincoln, a person that was the most popular man of color in the country at the time, if the hotel could discriminate against a man like this, of course they were discriminating against other African Americans. But Douglass never brought this up to Dutcher. Instead, he slept, he ate the food, he slept, and he left the hotel the next morning to catch his train to Chicago. The question I want to leave with you is, why didn't he say? What would he say to his friend? What could he say to his friend? What would his friend say in response? That conversation never occurred. But I want to leave with you the question as to why wasn't that question even raised What was it that prohibited or made Douglass feel that he could not ask that question of a friend? What's at the base of this story and the next one I'm going to share is that these kinds of encounters aren't occurring between Blacks and whites who don't know each other, Blacks and whites who have no relationship or experience hostility with each other, but between Blacks and whites who are friends and have history with each other. There's that gulf, that chasm that exists, for which neither Frederick Douglass nor Gilbert Dutcher, felt armed or confident enough to breach. And so this became an unspoken moment in their history, an awkward moment in their history that was left unreconciled. Next story I want to share with you deals much later in the years leading up to women's suffrage. Nellie Francis, who, as was just mentioned, I appreciate you mentioning her, was an African-American woman living in St. Paul. She had a national reputation. She was known by a number of people across the country and had met, actually, by this time in her life, 3 presidents. Excuse me. She was also a person who became very active in the women's suffrage movement. Now, what I mean by that is that she had always been active in women's suffrage, but that she had only recently gotten active in trying to bridge the gulf between Black suffragists and white suffragists. It is now 1919. It is the year when Minnesota will seek to ratify the amendment that will become the 19th Amendment in 1920. But as the year is 1919. Francis plays a key role in bridging the gap between white suffragists and Black suffragists, and it is quite difficult for her. Because on one hand, she's dealing with people who have not dealt with each other. White suffragists lived in a separate world. White people lived in a separate world from Blacks. Their worlds were parallel from each other. The question became, how does she make that connection between these two people who did not really have high expectations of building a strong and effective partnership? What she had to do was to try to bridge an even wider chasm when you consider that the histories of both groups were so diametrically opposed to each other or opposite from each other. To be specific, many of the women in the white suffrage group were middle class, Northern European, were familiar with each other, only had dealt with people of their class, and having views of African Americans that lowered their sense of expectation that African Americans either had the interest in suffrage or had the abilities to contribute anything to the campaign. So there was a little bit of paternalism going on. On the other hand, African American women, did not have any kind of warmth towards white suffragists also. It was a very awkward situation because their history was very, very different. Their history included what had happened in the United States since Reconstruction, when the 15th Amendment was passed. In the wake of the 15th Amendment, it seemed that sparked a widespread movement of white supremacy. And as you know from your history, Reconstruction was a very bloody and violent time in America. And it occurred during the watch of when friends of the Republican Party and of the Lincoln Republican Party were in power, that this kind of abuse and tyranny against African Americans was occurring when there was no protection on the part of white allies to step in, for all intents and purposes. But even more recently, I referred to 1919 being an important year, and it was. It was also a year not only for ultimately the 19th Amendment being ratified in Minnesota, but it was also a year called the Red Summer, which is a time when you had a huge number of race riots occurring and white on Black riots occurring throughout the nation, both in the North and in the South. And this was happening almost without any kind of hue and cry from white allies. And so there's a sense of abandonment that African-American women felt in particular. There's a picture of the riot in East St. Louis that occurred. It was a cartoon, political cartoon, that depicts an African-American woman on her knees with her two children huddled around her. Her arms are outstretched, and she's begging for President Wilson to do something about it. Make America safe for democracy was what she was beseeching him to do, for justice. So there was a sense that the African-American woman was especially vulnerable to the kinds of things that were happening in the South throughout the country. There's also the understanding on the part of African-Americans that once political equality is extended to African-Americans, really bad things happen. Of course, as I said before, the Reconstruction period was an example of that. Of course, what was happening throughout the first 2 decades of the 20th century is another example of that. But then once the ratification of the suffrage movement of suffrage was passed, was created in 1919, months later, you had the lynching of 3 Blacks in Duluth. Now, this, of course, was not due to the ratification of the suffrage movement, but to African-American women who lived in a situation in which they lived in a world vastly outnumbered by white people they didn't know, and who had not been there for their race during times of trial and tribulation. There was this concern about how secure they were in the state itself, and no one was talking about that as well. Nellie was trying to create a bond between Black women to overlook that fear so that they could be available and be able to work with whites who didn't expect much from the Blacks. You could see how these two worlds were living in parallel realities. The thing is that she did not feel that it was important to spend a lot of time talking about that history, going through education. She needed to figure out how to be expeditious and expedient in bringing these two camps together without spending the time of explaining and apologizing for both sides. And so the question that I come down to is this: is it possible? I mean, was that the proper tact to take, to try to be expeditious in dealing with the exact campaign without talking about public education of the two parties involved? Trying to explain why Black people felt the way they did to white people, trying to explain to white people what were the circumstances that compelled Blacks to feel the way they did. Now, as we all know, not only was the 19th Amendment ratified in 1919, it was also ratified nationally in 1920. We also know that in the wake of the lynchings of the 3 Black men in Duluth, Nellie got involved in that campaign. She and her husband actually drafted the legislation that would later be adopted by the legislature. And it is in my view that it was because of her work with the suffrage movement that she received the contacts and the connections to be able to persuade all the legislators to vote in favor of making a law that defined lynching as a crime. Can you imagine? Lynching was not a crime up until that point. Years later, only 3 years later, when she and her husband moves into a white neighborhood, a Klan sympathizing organization of neighbors began to burn crosses on her lawn. And the thing about that is that despite all of the connections and contacts that Nellie formed with the power elite of the state of Minnesota and in St. Paul, basically the Francis couple was left alone to deal with that kind of harassment. So, I want to leave that with you, the nature of when you're, the chasm deals with making decisions that are expeditious. In this particular context, she allowed the absence of conversation among the two because of the sense of urgency to get the bigger issue at that time through, namely suffrage. for women. One final thing I want to share with you, is that the proper strategy to apply? And I think there's an argument on both sides. One thing I want to share with you before I stop and open it up for questions, conference, is a statement that she wrote actually in 1918 for a husband who was giving a speech to an all-white male organization. William Francis was an attorney, and up until this time had been extremely, he had been a Booker T. Washington advocate. He had been a person who had always been very courtly with white people and very supportive. He was not considered a radical, but he delivers this speech, which I think reflects the thinking of Nellie, his wife, more so than anything else. He says this: as the Negro gains in culture, in efficiency, in his struggle for a competence, he withdraws into a world of his own, a world which lies all about the white man, yet whose existence you rarely expect. The inefficiency of the race, the handicapped, the unambitious, the physically and morally degenerate, all these remain in the economic morass which you regard as purely racial. He's talking to an audience of friendly white people now. He says, all these remain in that economic morass which you regard as purely racial. And from that class is drawn the notorious Negro and the jailbird. This kind of Negro attracts your attention, but as fast as a Negro rises out of that class, he disappears from your field of vision. For as the Negro rises higher in intellectual and industrial levels in most of the sections of this country, he is by segregation pushed out of your lives and denied the right to compete with the white man. I think this is the first statement of candor that exists. And so, not only is the sentiment worth reflecting on, considering the existence of segregation now and racially identified patterns in terms of housing and schools and employment and things of this nature. But it's the candor itself is what is noteworthy, where for the first time, people who tended to tiptoe around the issue are being much more outspoken in how they see the world and what they see as a problem of the world itself. So with that, I'm going to stop and we can open up for discussion or questions or comments.
Dr. Green, if you're willing, so Angie and I had the opportunity to talk with Dr. Green a bit last week, and actually Angie has had quite a bit of conversation. And one of the things that you talked about last week that struck both Angie and me is you talked a little bit about how the fact that Minnesota has this legacy of progressive policy, how that has not translated really into opportunities for Black Minnesotans. And so if you're willing, I would love for you to share a little bit of that, because I really think it helps connect the dots between these historical examples that you've shared and kind of the continued failure of our states, I'll say Minnesota and Wisconsin, but for you, Minnesota, to close that gap when it comes to educational achievement, economic achievement, and just equity in general, especially for Blacks in Minnesota.
Well, there's a paradox here. Minnesotans have typically, at least throughout the 19th century and into the 20th century, and to an extent into the 21st century, have elected progressive political leaders. But in through them, there is the determination or the interest in passing laws that reflect that political or philosophic view. On the other hand, that sensibility has not historically been pressed down into the body politic, so that there's a parallel universe existing between the policymakers and those who are governed. For example, I go back to Nellie and William in their house, where they were attacked by mobs simply because they were Blacks moving into an all-white neighborhood. And this is occurring in St. Paul, which supposedly had been friendly. It had banned the showing Birth of a Nation. It had passed an ordinance that said the Birth of a Nation can't show here for, for reasons that are fairly obvious. The point that I'm making here is that you had policymakers, political leaders. The governor at the time was president of the NAACP, but it is also on his watch that 3 Black men were lynched. So you had policymakers who were very complacent to the rightness of their thinking, but not in a position to really spread that philosophy into the body politic, sharing it, making it a part of how people think about what it is to be Minnesota. There had been a disinclination to want to really push that deep into the way that Minnesotans defined themselves, that the artifice seemed more important than the actual action itself. And I think that's something that continued well into the 21st century. I'll give an example, more graphic, immediate example. When I worked in the school district, one of the most controversial issues that we dealt with really was changing residential patterns for students. In one situation, one neighborhood that was located down the street from a neighborhood that was predominantly of color, but this particular neighborhood was predominantly white and middle class. We drew the boundaries so that the children in that particular area would be going to a school that was closer to them, because up until this time, they were going to a school on the opposite side of town to the great expense of the school district for busing. When we offered that as a proposal, the parents from the neighborhood who had voted for Obama twice said that if we impose that redistricting, they would leave the district. And ironically enough, they talked about going to a school in the suburbs that featured desegregation, racial diversity. So you have that kind of contrast going on. It's one thing to espouse the philosophy of diversity, and on the other hand, actually implementing it. One of the things that constantly exists for friends of diversity is the sense that, well, it requires a sacrifice to actually implement that view. It requires a sacrifice that becomes very, very difficult to pay for, to deal with. And in many ways, it's understandable. I would be afraid of sending my kids to a school that I perceive to be dangerous. But in giving into that fear, and I might also say that not all parents felt this way in other areas of the city where they were sending their kids to schools that were no longer as white and middle class as where they had been sending. But this is an example of how, on one hand, it's easy to support an idea, but not really implement it, because the implementation costs too much. It requires too much of a sympathy. And we've been allowed to get through with the best of intentions. And that's one reason why we haven't really addressed the real cost of sustaining any kind of significant change. One final thing, and then I don't mean to talk as much on this topic, but during the days of George Floyd, I received, I don't know how many, I got a lot of interviews from reporters who felt that and wanted me to say that this was a major change, that we're about to enter a new era simply because of the people going to the streets. And that was an impressive thing to see people go to the streets, young people and old. But, I've been around for a long time. I've been around for a long, long time. And I was trying to say that we should wait and see how this turns out, that, there are many moments in our history, modern and older history, where people came together to deal with an injustice. One example might be the Civil War. But then afterwards, the problem of integrating people of different races and different ethnicities and different classes together, the problem and the sacrifice that it required for society to be able to do that was oftentimes too high. And the duration of that challenge was too long. And so as a result, the campaign was allowed to die while people got distracted in other issues and other priorities. That, I think, is the legacy of Minnesota for the most part. It's a state filled with people that intend to do the right thing. But the price of doing the right thing is very, very, very high. And and there are many other things that people have to worry about, like taxes and health, and well, you can list the things. So I think that's kind of what's going on.
So you alluded to the policy versus practice differentiation, and I know, in some of the reading I did about you in preparation for today, one of the things that you really focused on when you were superintendent was making sure that decisions were being made based on very strong relationships with the people who were going to be most impacted by those decisions, right. that the relationship there, the trust, the knowledge was really important. We have several questions from people who are kind of wondering about that piece, who are looking for the actionables, saying, so we live in communities here where, we acknowledge, those of us on this call, probably we acknowledge that as white Americans, that we have a certain level of privilege and power, but aren't quite sure, there's policy and there's practice, right? So kind of your thoughts about what are the things that people should be thinking about doing to move us forward, and people. And then there are also a couple questions that relate to organizations. We've seen a lot of postings for diversity, equity, and inclusion leadership roles in companies. Cities are looking at adopting a more DEI kind of framework for their work. So without trying to boil the ocean, kind of, are there some actionables that make most sense when you're talking with your students, with community leaders about kind of what to do next? Some ideas that you might share with the folks who are here today?
Well, I've been teaching history for a long time, so I'm out of the world of reality. So I don't know if I can come up with answers, but I can tell you, as I mentioned earlier, we did have some successes in neighborhoods that had been predominantly white and middle class in diversifying student in enrollment. And what we did in order to be able to do that was that we had excellent principals, and we encouraged families in the white neighborhoods to actually visit the schools and form a relationship with the principal who had those kinds of skills. She had proven herself as an educational leader. She had the support of her teachers who had been doing excellent work in achievement. The test scores showed it, even though it was a ramshackle building, the kids were doing very well. And that was the kind of thing that allowed parents to be able to, well, among their own group, there was a critical mass of them willing to go in together. And we did what we could to help them go in as a group. So there wasn't one person who was taking it on for themselves. You have to, I think policymakers cannot assume that people are always acting on self-interest and out of the negative, that they're basically trying to make oftentimes, the right decision for their kids. And that does not necessarily mean rejecting policies that reject diversity. You have to kind of spend time understanding, I think policymakers have to spend time understanding what it is that parents really are looking for. Are they looking for stability in the leadership? Are they looking for the relationship that's critical between parents and the principal? Are they looking for stability in teacher teacher hiring, for example? Will the parents and the kids have a chance to form that valuable relationship with a teacher that will transcend from year to year? It's that kind of connection that I think, it's a human connection that has to be made. Oftentimes policymakers will make a decision and the people who are impacted are left to deal with it alone, in isolation. So I think that in making significant change, there has to be kind of a holistic approach to the community that you're dealing with. It's not just in terms of the school, but you have to be structured that way too. You have to have people who are thinking beyond just the confines of the classroom and beyond just the confines of success being defined according to numbers on a sheet that determines that illustrates academic success. So I think those are the kinds of things that I would suggest. If you're going to make change, you have to think in larger terms than just pigeonholing a child for this school to reach a certain racial balance. I think that almost always fails. It's been my experience, at least.
So Dr. Green, we had a question about how we as a community can create spaces where people feel safe having difficult conversations. And another question related but different about how we can, in a community that does not have a lot of racial diversity, continue to put people in situations where hopefully they are talking with folks whose life experiences are different than their own. So two related questions, I think.
Well, I think you already have the answer to that. I mean, these kinds of conversations that you've initiated are an excellent start. I think that anything that allows two communities to come together, for example, not necessarily to sit down and hash out the race problem, but breaking of bread, having some sort of low, some sort of relatively safe exchange, like the sharing of a meal over a shared holiday of some sort, where people can get to know each other. Sometimes big issues have a way of intimidating people, repelling people because it becomes too heavy. To form the relationship that you're talking about requires the formation of trust, and trust doesn't happen if people don't feel comfortable with people. So comfort cannot be underestimated, it seems to me. People live where they live, but I think that if there's some effort placed in how do I get communities together in a comfortable environment where they can just get to know each other as people, that can serve as a foundation, as a segue to the deeper conversations. But you got to have that relationship first. The trust can't come with just the head. It must come with the heart.
So a question about, the Black Lives Matter movement obviously preceded George Floyd's death, but George Floyd's death certainly lit a flame, as the person asking the question stated. Is that going to be a sustained higher level of energy with that movement, or what do you see in the future for Minnesota and Wisconsin when it comes to that heightened awareness of that movement and the issues related to it?
Well, I'm hopeful, but I think it remains to be seen. I mean, I'm very happy about what happened today, as are a lot of people. I'm also very hopeful in many ways because the leaders seem to be talking about the need to deal with an integrated series of problems. That has tended to discourage policymakers from addressing big issues. And I think that if we can, to come at it a different way too. One of the things that gave me a sense of hope was when our own Governor Walz, back immediately during the George Floyd issues, when demonstrations were occurring, he said we have to deal with systemic racism, but he began to try to define it, and that's something that seldom happened. He talked about it in terms of not just police-community relations, but education and employment and housing and health and a number of things that have to be considered. That can be overwhelming. But I think that kind of systemic approach to dealing with issues is what's really called for. And unless we have the commitment to continue that, and that can only come from our leadership, making that a priority to the leadership, being a cheerleader for that, approach, that continued sense of sacrifice. Like we're at war, we're at war with whatever. Unless we have that kind of inspiration, people will understandably begin to, move away to other issues. Folks are dealing with major challenges in their lives, and you can't deny that. And will probably the chief challenge that they face is that they have to deal with these challenges, or they are made to feel like they have to deal with these challenges in isolation. The challenge of a leader is to create a sense of community, which, sustains itself because of the bond that's created as a result of the relationships that form over a meal, for example, people getting to talk. So one thing relates to the other, I think. So I think it's possible things can change, but I think it really remains to be seen whether we have that ability to sustain that challenge.
So speaking of leadership, I think someone just threw your own question back at you in a way.
Uh-oh.
We've got a question. Do you think,
I try not to pay attention to what I say, so.
do you think that President Biden should utilize the same tactics that Nellie Francis did to bring disparate parties together?
Well, I think not, in this sense. Nellie was not in the business of explaining one group to the other. And I understand why she didn't want to spend that kind of time dealing with changing people's attitudes that have taken over a year, because they're trying to win a campaign. That this was a time in history that was fleeting, the willingness of a society to give women the right to vote. That wasn't something to be taken for granted. I think in Biden's sense, he thinks already in terms of bringing people together by facilitating a sense of comity, comity, among people, of encouraging communal education, community education, of validating people's experiences, teaching us how to interact with each other through being able to listen, and to not assume the defensive in having conversations. I mean, his approach appears to me different than where Nellie came from. I thought Nellie was heroic, and I still think she was heroic, and I really appreciate my wife tolerating me living with her as long as I did. But I think that, one of the things that excites me about a Biden presidency is not just that he's a Democrat, but because there's a moral imperative that he brings to the work that seems to include the need for people to see each other as Americans, and that, yeah, we're all hurting, but there's a way that we can resolve some of this stuff by staying together, and through that, talking and learning about each other, through the engagement with each other, that we see that we have more in common than we don't. That wasn't necessarily something that Nellie really focused on at the time. I don't criticize her for that. It's a different time in history, but I think that's one reason why I feel a little bit more hopeful than I did.
Got it. I think one final question that brings together a couple folks who have posted wondering about initiatives that take folks from communities like ours that are not very racially diverse and take them to visit and engage with more diverse communities. So there are references to the Northside Achievement Zone, Marnita's Table. Kind of, what are your thoughts about that, and how do you do that in a way that doesn't feel like cultural tourism?
Oh, that's an excellent question, and I think, it's an excellent question. I think that it has to do with cultural tourism, is based on the notion that I'm sitting in this bus, I'm looking through the window as we slide through an area. And at the end of the trip, we're going back home again. And, we can kind of, point to the space as a place where we've been. I think it is not necessarily traveling to a particular neighborhood, although I think that's always a good thing. But I think it's, what are you going to do once you're there? What's the nature of engagement of the people there? Is there a presumed sense of power that is shared? When people have money or have luxuries that other people don't have, there's a sense of privilege, and we know that word. We've heard it used a lot these days. But society is very sensitive to the issue of privilege, and it can be the thing that serves as an impediment to improving relationships. So, I think that if it's reciprocal, or if there's a safe zone or a common zone, I don't know where the place would be. Working with churches, for example, I think churches can be an incredibly valuable partner to your community in forming a partnership. I think that could be very useful. And having, if you do set up a relationship with a church on the north side of Minneapolis, for example, bring them into the discussion, have them, participate in what would be most beneficial for achieving this relationship, and don't feel the need to come up with a solution that you're imposing. That not you, but that one is imposing. The solution has to be communal. That's the sharing of power. And what we talked about with Frederick Douglass, for example, he couldn't be candid even with his friend. And that's kind of the history of civil rights in Minnesota in the second half of the 19th century. We had a lot of white people who did great things for Black people, like freedom, and extensive citizenship and voting rights. How can we tell them that the world that they have left us to live in is still inadequate? Why, we live in a society that says that we have to be able to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps, and yet, the ballot doesn't require a person who has a farm to sell it to me. They could still deny me of that. Well, I need to be able to educate my colleague, my white colleague, as to what the nature of the problem is. And I don't want to say, give them reason to believe that because a problem still exists, that somehow they were wrong in placing their hopes and whatever on me. So it's kind of sharing power in a sense, and that's always a scary thing.
Dr. Green, thank you so much. When Angie and I had a chance to meet with Dr. Green, he said, and after talking with him, we agreed he could talk for hours, and I wish we had hours. But thank you so much. We got to most, but not all of the questions, so I apologize. But your last remarks, Dr. Green, make me think. I know many of you were listening to coverage this morning before and during the inauguration. And one of the things I heard someone mention was that I think it's the preamble to the Constitution. It doesn't say we're building a perfect union. It says we're building a more perfect union. Right? And so those folks who years ago thought they got the job done, and we're still working on it. So it's always that hopeful, forward-looking, more perfect, and hopefully we're making things better and better, even if we still have work to do that we're leaving for the next generation. So thank you so much. So important to have this history in mind as we are thinking about how we move forward. So thank you for sharing all of your, well, not all of your knowledge, a very small slice of your knowledge.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Thanks again to our partner, First State Bank and Trust. I am looking forward to our next Conversation of the Valley event on Wednesday, March 17th. So mark your calendars, Wednesday, March 17th, when artist, poet, historian, and teacher, Dr. Gwen Westerman, will join us to talk about what she calls the Dakota people's travel ways in the St. Croix River Valley. So I hope you will join us for that event. Registration, if it's not already open, will be open very soon. In the meantime, if you're wondering about what else is happening here in the Valley related to this topic, I encourage you, if you haven't already, to look around your own community. Here in Hudson, where our offices are located, community members came together a few months ago and installed a new mural. It's right on Main Street, just down from all of the restaurants and shops. So if you haven't yet checked it out, please do. I should say it's right on the Main Street, which is actually 2nd Street. In River Falls, in Stillwater, our very own Stillwater Area Community Foundation, one of our affiliates, is about to launch a racial and social justice grant program. So if you are in Stillwater or part of an organization serving the Stillwater community, you'll hear more about that soon. And if you're not sure where else to go to learn more about these types of efforts, please pay special attention to the email you'll receive after today's event. It will include a link to some resources related to today's event, including a recording of this session and a discussion guide. So some of Dr. Green's questions, which we encourage you to use if you're going to be talking with friends after today's presentation. It will also include a link to a brief online survey. So please do take a few minutes to complete that. Your feedback really does help us make these events even better in the future. And if you're new to this event and to the work of the St. Croix Valley Foundation and would like to know more, and I hope you will, please visit our website, www.scvfoundation.org, or give us a call, 715-386-9490. Thank you again for joining us today. Be safe, be well, and I hope we'll see you next time.